hard to imagine that in the cold weapon era over 1,000 years ago, someone could actually research and develop such large-scale lethal weapons full of ingenuity. At Count Odo's command, a huge wheel full of iron spikes rushed towards the Viking warriors on the promenade. Seeing such a terrifying thing for the first time, the Viking warriors were so frightened they immediately turned tail and fled. But since this was an enclosed bridge corridor, many warriors in the front were still crushed and pierced. The terrifying thing about this spiked meat grinder was that people didn't die immediately after being crushed. The heart-wrenching screams also stimulated every person still alive. But soon, Floki seemed to discover the drawback of this spiked meat grinder. This thing relied on inertia to slide on a track. Once it encountered resistance and stopped, it needed manpower to control the iron chain to pull the wheel back. Rollo stepped forward. He took a long crossbow bolt, stripped off his upper body, and flipped over the spiked meat grinder. Then he stuck his long crossbow bolt in the ground, blocking the spiked meat grinder. No matter how Odo shouted, the control device couldn't retract the wheel. At the same time, a large number of Viking warriors flipped over the spiked meat grinder and charged towards the city of Paris. It seemed the scales of victory had already tipped to the Vikings' side. But how did they cross the city gate, like a wall of bronze and iron, and enter the bridge corridor? Just a few days ago, the siege of Paris with Floki as commander had ended in failure. The Vikings' casualties were countless. Ragnar had also fallen from the city wall. Although Ragnar fell into a pile of corpses and barely saved his life, the impact still injured his kidneys. Even his urine was blood red. Ragnar didn't tell anyone about this. He felt his days were numbered. So he found Floki, wanting to have a heart-to-heart talk with him. At this time, Floki was still immersed in self-blame. He still couldn't believe that despite his devotion to the gods, he was ultimately abandoned by them. Floki, bare-chested, seemed so small and helpless. Ragnar didn't blame Floki too much. He just told Floki he wouldn't give up invading Paris. Tonight, he would arrange a sneak attack. As night fell, Lagertha took a few shield maidens and quietly snuck into the corridor on the Seine River. They made no sound and didn't alert any guards. Under the cover of darkness, they eliminated the enemies on the corridor one by one. The enemy's crossbow bolts followed closely behind, but faced with this predicament, Lagertha directly picked up the torch beside her and ignited the hot oil. The flames burned down the city gate, and outside the quiet gate, a large number of Viking soldiers had long gathered there. Just like that, Lagertha used the smallest sacrifice to breach the city gate that had been difficult to take down before. The Vikings rushed towards the corridor like wolves and tigers, but they didn't expect the Parisians' defense to be an impenetrable fortress. They brought out their ultimate weapon, the spiked meat grinder, to resist the Vikings' attack. Fortunately, Rollo found the flaw in this thing and led the Vikings to charge towards the city of Paris. This was the second time Gisela saw Rollo. She never imagined there could be such a brave man in the world. Seeing this scene, Odo began to panic. He hurriedly went to find King Charles. He hoped the king could put on armor and personally go to the front line to boost morale. But Charles was a timid and cowardly person. He said it would be useless for him to go. With his daughter there, it was enough. Odo had no choice but to return to the battlefield with a stiff upper lip. On the way back, he happened to meet the king's imperial guards. These people all expressed their willingness to be deployed by Odo, so a large number of soldiers poured to the city gate, and the two sides engaged in fierce hand-to-hand combat. In an instant, the entire narrow corridor was crammed with people, packed in layers, letting nothing through. A few brave warriors killed their way out from the gaps between people. The crowded space made it hard for them to even swing their axes. Facing the human sea tactics of the Parisians, Rollo knew that they could never break into the city this way. So in order to cut losses in time, he ordered everyone to retreat collectively. The Parisians raised the drawbridge. In the end, that old woman named Cynric was captured and became a prisoner, because Cynric knew the Frankish language and was also knowledgeable about Viking affairs. Odo did not kill her. Odo brought Cynric before Charles to be judged. Cynric told Charles that she didn't belong to any country or nation, she was just a wanderer. Charles felt keeping Cynric seemed useful, so he didn't kill her. Odo asked Cynric who that brave warrior was who single-handedly destroyed the device. He had never seen such a powerful person before. Cynric replied,
"His name is Rollo. He is the brother of King Ragnar, the leader of the Northmen. He is a famous warrior. He fights like a crazy bear."
Cynric describes Rollo as being like a giant bear gone mad when he fights. I wonder if everyone remembers what the seer once told Rollo about the bear and the princess's wedding. It seems Rollo's good fortune will soon arrive. At the same time, while the Vikings were attacking Paris, Egbert in England also encountered a headache. It turned out that just like Egbert destroying the Viking settlement, Gwenthryth also went back on her word. She no longer acknowledged herself as a vassal state of Wessex. Not only was she unwilling to pay taxes to Egbert, she even killed the nobles Egbert sent to the kingdom of Mercia. Egbert was furious and sent Ethelwulf to threaten Gwenthryth that if she didn't continue paying taxes, they would meet on the battlefield. Ethelwulf went on orders. Gwenthryth didn't beat around the bush either and directly had a servant bring out a child in swaddling clothes.
Prince Magnus. Hello, darling.
That is a northern name, that is not one of ours.
How clever you. Yes, he's named after his father.
His father?
I think you may know him. Ragnar Lothbrok.
It turned out this child was the one she had with Ragnar. Gwenthryth dared to turn against Egbert precisely because she was relying on Ragnar, but what she didn't know was that the Viking settlement was long gone. Egbert had already broken with Ragnar.
In which case it would inconvenience us a great deal if he were to find a ready ally here in Mercia. He cannot help you, and you can't threaten us with him.
Knowing her relationship with Ragnar couldn't threaten Egbert, Gwenthryth could only obediently pay taxes. Ethelwulf completed his mission, but he didn't know he had been cuckolded again. The one who cuckolded him this time was none other than his father. Egbert promised to protect Judith and his young son, but Judith had to pay a price. As for what that price was, it couldn't be more obvious.
I want you to be my mistress.
Then you will protect Alfred. Look after him.
Get into the bed.
Although they had lost over 1,000 men and horses, Ragnar didn't give up his desire to invade Paris. He ordered the remaining troops to camp at the city gate of Paris, with no intention of withdrawing at all. Odo, besieged inside the city, was at his wit's end. Originally, the city's food reserves were already very short, and now they encountered a large-scale plague. A large number of people died in this plague. If this continued, the Vikings wouldn't need to invade, they would perish on their own. Odo found the king and explained the current predicament. Although the defense of Paris was impenetrable and the Parisians had been victorious in both battles, the Vikings clearly had the advantage in numbers. If they went out of the city for a direct confrontation, they had no chance of winning. Odo suggested negotiating. Since the Vikings' goal was to raid the city, they should compensate them with some gold to send these Vikings away. But Gisla didn't agree. She said civilized people shouldn't submit to barbarians. They had a heated argument. King Charles also couldn't make up his mind, so he decided to listen to God's will at church the next morning. On the Vikings' side, the successive defeats had lowered their morale. They had tried direct confrontation and night raids, but just couldn't take Paris. Just as they were thinking about which part had gone wrong, a group of Parisian soldiers brought Cynric to the Vikings' camp. It turned out Charles had ultimately chosen to negotiate. It could be seen that Ragnar's health was already very weak at this time. He could only lie down to receive the envoy.
King Ragnar, the French want to discuss a way to end the siege.
Why?
They don't believe you are capable of breaching the city walls.
I say we are. And what will they give us if we lift the siege?
That would be decided at a meeting between you and the commander of the city, Count Odo.
After stating the specific terms of the negotiation, the envoy prepared to leave with Cynric, but Rollo walked up and directly cut the rope the envoy was leading. Faced with this giant bear-like warrior, the envoy showed fear on his face. Terrified, he had no choice but to obediently release Cynric and then slink away. After the Parisians left, the Viking side instantly erupted. Aside from Ragnar, not a single person was willing to accept the negotiation. They insisted on attacking into the city. Even if they couldn't break in, they would starve them out. Ragnar endured the severe pain and stood up, declaring to everyone who was the king of the Vikings.
And I did not become king out of ambition, but once again, I had no choice. As a result of other people's actions. And as a ruler, I have the last say. Me! With no more discussion, we shall meet the Franks tomorrow.
Early the next morning, Rollo discovered Ragnar was gone. Without a doubt, Ragnar must have taken people to the city of Paris alone to negotiate, so the crowd immediately chased after him. At this time, Ragnar was weakly meeting Odo, leaning on a wooden staff. Neither side wasted words. Odo asked right away how much money it would take for them to leave. Was 5,760 pounds of gold enough? Then he said their reinforcements would arrive soon. Hearing this, Ragnar instantly laughed. You won't have any reinforcements at all, and 5,760 pounds of gold and silver is too little. I have another important thing I need your help with. But for you, it should be worthless. Odo asked what it was. Ragnar said,
I want to be baptized.
Si va che baptizated levet said.
And when I die, I want to be reunited with my Christian friend, who happens to be in your heaven.
Non el paradis.
He says you will go to hell, not heaven.
Ragnar went up and caressed the priest. Then he made the priest baptize him right there. The priest placed Ragnar in the river water to perform the baptism ceremony. Ragnar missed Athelstan so much that he wanted to convert to the enemy's god, and this scene was seen by Lagertha and the others who had hurried over. Floki was furious. He instantly collapsed. For the Vikings, Ragnar's action was a complete desecration of the gods, and after the baptism, Ragnar's entire mental state seemed to have been reborn. Not long after, the Parisians fulfilled their promise and sent over 5,760 pounds of gold. They hoped the Vikings would also keep their promise to leave Paris and return to their own land. Rollo told Ragnar this news, but Ragnar said it had nothing to do with him, because he felt his days were numbered. In the evening, the Vikings sang and danced, celebrating this victory. Although they had lost over 1,000 people, this war was undoubtedly also a bountiful harvest. Just as the Vikings were celebrating, Ragnar called Bjorn to his room and gave him a special task.
I have something I only just you to do for me.
Ragnar's health was deteriorating day by day. He had already started instructing Floki to build him a coffin. What this meant went without saying. In the blink of an eye, a month passed. Odo stood on the city tower, looking at the Vikings' camp. Seeing they showed no intention of leaving, Odo decided to go investigate for himself. After all, the negotiation was his idea. Arriving at the Vikings' camp, Odo directly asked, "We already gave you the money. Why aren't you leaving yet?"
Our king, my father Ragnar Lothbrok, is too weak and ill to travel.
Malazes Ragnar Lothbrok, nostro reis sis peres, patrova affaiblissant, cheminer ne poet.
Vos est?
Oi, morvalets.
Odo enters the house and finds Ragnar lying on the bed dying. Bjorn said to Odo, "My father has one more request. He wants a Christian funeral. If it can't be held, the Vikings will not leave." Seeing the weak Ragnar and thinking back to Ragnar's baptism, Odo finally agreed to Ragnar's request. That night, a sorrowful melody resounded through the Vikings' camp. Bjorn sat by the fire, silently weeping. Even the Parisian soldiers on the city walls could feel the sadness through the singing. Ragnar lay peacefully in the coffin. Bjorn closed the lid and told the people standing outside they could talk to Ragnar, meaning to say their final true feelings. The first to come bid farewell to Ragnar was his ex-wife Lagertha. Lagertha didn't want Ragnar to go to heaven, because then they couldn't meet in Valhalla. Lagertha said she had always loved Ragnar and never stopped. Only in a situation like this could Lagertha speak her true feelings without reservation. Then it was Rollo. He said he had always hated Ragnar, from childhood to adulthood. Ragnar was everyone's pride. He seemed so superfluous. He also said Ragnar was just an ordinary mortal. Rollo's words contained more reluctance to part. The last was Floki. He had always followed Ragnar. Floki loved him and hated him. It was Ragnar who ignited his desire for battle. At the same time, Ragnar betrayed the Norse gods, the faith he was willing to defend with his life. The next day, Amid everyone's farewells, Ragnar's coffin was carried into the great hall inside the city of Paris. The king of Paris and the ministers were all in the hall. They held a grand Christian funeral for Ragnar, but the next second, a terrible thing happened before their eyes. Ragnar jumped out of the coffin and then took out his dagger, holding it to Charles's throat. At the same time, the Viking warriors who were carrying the coffin grabbed the weapons they had hidden inside the coffin and held the princes and nobles hostage. When he saw the priest beside him who had once cursed him to go to hell, Ragnar stabbed the man's throat. This scene stunned Charles. Charles never expected the cunning Ragnar to infiltrate the royal palace of Paris by feigning his own death. However, Gisela wasn't scared by the ruthless Ragnar. She rushed up, trying to rescue her father, but she was grabbed by the throat by Ragnar and ultimately became a hostage. Ragnar and the accompanying warriors took Gisela and headed out of the city. Charles directly fainted from fright. When they reached the bridge corridor, Ragnar immediately ordered his men to cut the ropes of the city gate's drawbridge. This meant the Vikings could charge straight in and enter the city of Paris unimpeded. The men opened the city gate. A large wave of Viking warriors had long been waiting here. Halfway through, Ragnar suddenly released Gisela. Gisela stood there, not daring to move rashly. In her heart, the Vikings were a group of demons who killed without batting an eye. But at this moment, her impression of these barbarians finally changed slightly. At the city gate, Bjorn waved his hand and the Vikings rushed into the city of Paris like wolves and tigers. Just like that, Ragnar broke through the city gate of Paris that had been difficult to take down before. Without spending a single soldier, the weak Ragnar walked out. Only at this moment did he finally collapse into his son's arms with relief. Seeing Ragnar come back from the dead, Lager the Rollo and Floki didn't know whether to be happy or angry about being deceived, but they still decided to settle the score with Ragnar after returning. The Vikings rushed into the city, burning, killing, and looting everywhere. They vented the emotions they had suppressed these days without restraint. After a round of plundering, they quickly left. At this moment, Charles was so scared he was still collapsed on the ground, eyes vacant. It wasn't until he heard Odo say the Vikings had left after looting that Charles slowly stood up. Back at camp, they're all furious with Ragnar for faking his death. They had said so many sincere words, all heard by Ragnar. This completely deceived their feelings, and only Bjorn knew about Ragnar's trick. Wasn't this clearly showing distrust in everyone? Bjorn said he was only acting according to his king father's orders. The king's orders couldn't be disobeyed, but at least the goal of breaking through Paris was achieved, so it could be considered perfect. Seeing that everyone didn't say anything more, Bjorn began to convey his king father's decree. Tomorrow, they would pull up camp and return to the Kattegat Strait. They would come back to Paris to loot next spring, to guard against future troubles. Father Ragnar hoped to leave some people here and also needed a leader to defend the place.
I will stay.
No. You have no reason to stay here, Floki.
And what reason do you have, Uncle? Then it is decided.
The reason Rollo chose to stay was self-evident, because he wanted to see what the bear and princess's wedding the seer spoke of actually prophesied. On the other side, upon learning the Vikings hadn't all left, Charles was on pins and needles every day. Feeling deeply apprehensive and fearful, he felt he should do something to resolve next year's crisis. So Gisela became the sacrificial victim of this political marriage. He wanted to give his daughter's hand in marriage to Rollo in exchange for lasting peace in Paris. Gisela strongly opposed, but in the end, the arm couldn't twist the thigh.
You will be offered a vast area of land in the northern part of Francia. The Emperor will also make you a duke, the highest honor he can bestow. You will be very rich and you will be very important.
When the messenger said that King Charles had promised Rollo land and titles, Rollo's face didn't make a ripple. It wasn't until the messenger said Princess Gisela would marry him that a rare smile appeared on Rollo's face. You may not understand the meaning of this sentence yet. The Parisians' intention was for Rollo to betray Ragnar and help Paris resist the Vikings' attacks. Rollo gave a cold laugh. He wanted to see if this princess was really worth him betraying his brother for. King Charles held a grand ceremony in the palace to welcome Rollo. But who knew? Gisela would scold Rollo to his face in front of everyone.
Qu'est-ce que disent mes pères, tel bestaille ne prendrait mis à père. Fille de grand lignage suis, non de folle pute garçonnière. Ni elles audrèrent de vivre qu'à s'offrir que telle glotte députèrent mat au chaste. Païen est, de ville estras, si amnade, tel totes besternèse. Azors guignon et as brognon miels audrait mon pucelage par puterie livrée cad isestui gosse vilain. Pas trop méords. Gossier cuide.
But unexpectedly, Rollo liked women with such a fierce temper. In Princess Gisla, he seemed to see the shadow of Lagertha, the woman he had longed for but could never have.
J'avoue, salut.
On the ship heading back, Ragnar called for Floki. He stared straight at Floki and said,
You killed Athelstan.
Floki remained silent. He had already read from Ragnar's fierce gaze what would be waiting for him next.